For those of you who don't know, I'm Riccardo, Fluffy Pony Spagni. You may know me as Fluffy Pony ZA on Reddit or Twitter. You may also know me as that gigantic troll on Twitter. Your mileage may vary. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is our nearly forgotten past, a little bit about what Monero is and does, Monero's birth and growth, and then what we're doing to make Monero useful and usable. So when we think back to how we used to transact, like really right at the beginning, cash was one of the earliest methods of transacting after we got rid of the barter system and so on. And we went from that to IOUs, and eventually checks came out and wire transfers and mechanisms like SWIFT and credit cards. And that led to transaction switching, and obviously then there was regulation and KYC and AML. And boo, exactly. But these things were in a way really cool because they increased our convenience. What they also did though is they decreased our privacy, and that sucks. So if we want to take our privacy back, we need to look at cash as a model. And the reason for that is that cash is extremely private. Cash also only relies on your OPSEC. So if you pay somebody a $100 note, well, $50 note because $100 are apparently bad, and they go and pay somebody else with that $50 note, there's no direct link to you. There might be external links to you, but the physical note doesn't magically link back to you. The amount of cash you have can be revealed by the owner, but it's not automatically revealed by some other electronic mechanism. There's no record of how much cash that you have purely based on the notes. And cash is also fungible. And this property of fungibility, where if I give you $50 and you give me two 20s and a 10, that's something that's mandated by law. So it's not something that's inherently in cash necessarily, because cash does, or lots of physical notes do have serial numbers on them, but it's a property that's mandated by law. When it comes to privacy, it's important to understand that privacy is not just for criminals. And this is the part where we don't talk about drugs. Because the thing is, privacy is good for other things, like we want to avoid advertising based on our spending habits. I don't want to see adverts based on what I bought on some other site yesterday. I would like to avoid targeted crime against the wealthy. Not that I'm wealthy, but I really don't want to go into a 7-Eleven, pay the person, and they know my bank balance. That's not ideal. Unintended leaking of sordid purchases. Do I really want everyone at the office knowing the stuff I buy? Unwitting complicity in criminal acts. I use a mixer, and now suddenly I've got Bitcoins that go to Coinbase, and Coinbase shuts my account. Not so great. Minor censorship. Miners start censoring transactions based on recipient, or because miners decide that transaction's spam. It can reveal sensitive business relationships, and it can leak salaries, profit margins, and revenues, all of which suck. The problem with this, of course, is people don't care. Well, at least they don't care yet. So this is from a Pew Research study in 2014, and they asked people, based on various pieces of information, what they considered to be sensitive and private. So a lot of people said, 90% of them said, well, my social security number, that's like super private, super sensitive, don't want that out there. And it goes down until you eventually get 8% that said their basic purchasing habits are private. Now that's pretty shocking. And the reason is that people are happy to compromise their privacy as long as they can play Farmville. And with Monero, we're trying to take that back. And we're trying to achieve true financial privacy, or at least a solid amount of financial privacy. I'm not going to dwell on Monero's cryptography too deeply, because otherwise you're all going to fall asleep. But what I do want to talk about is the 4 things we're doing to enhance financial privacy in a cryptocurrency that is similar to Bitcoin, but not based on Bitcoin's code at all. The first thing is we have stealth addresses, and that means that we're able to hide where transactions are going to. We then have this cool thing called ring signatures, which means we can hide where transactions are coming from. Then we have this thing called ring confidential transactions that allows us to cryptographically hide transaction values, so you don't know the amount of a transaction. And lastly, we have our own implementation of I2P, an I2P router, which we're using to hide the source IP address that first broadcasts a transaction. If you had to look at a Monero transaction on a blockchain, the way we make things cryptographically unlinkable, so you don't know where they're going to, is instead of like Bitcoin, where you can look at it on a blockchain and see, oh, it's going to an address, we have this cool stealth address thing, and they all seem to go to these like random numbers or random addresses. And so that means that if you look at it on a block explorer, you can't see which of these outputs, the red ones, are going to a recipient, and the gray ones that are coming back to me, because they all just seem to go to some random destination. Similarly, we have this cool thing called a ring signature, and what that does is we go and pick random outputs on the blockchain, and we form this ring signature that appears to spend all of those outputs simultaneously, but it's actually only spending one of them. And we use this cool thing called a key image to make sure that the true signature, the one that is really ours, is sort of got a hash of it so that we can't double spend an output. Now, the cool thing about this is that this ring signature that we create, or that a Monero user creates, can be done completely offline with a copy of the blockchain. It requires no input or assistance from any of the people that own those outputs, and it can be done in a way that is trustless, which of course is the thing that we want. We then have this thing called Ring CT, which is based on Greg Maxwell's confidential transactions, and it uses this cool thing called commitments, and I'm so not going to get into commitments and how that works, but basically what ends up happening is instead of putting an amount, you pay a commitment as a value, and then we have this cool thing called a Ring CT ring signature, which signs the difference between commitments, and magically you just can't see the amount on the input either. And so ultimately what you end up with, if you look at a blockchain, or if you look at a block explorer rather, is you can't see where transactions come from. They appear to come from any number of old transactions, old and new. You can't see where the transactions are going to or who they're paying. And you can't see the amounts that are being spent. And that alone is pretty powerful. And that's currently live. That's something you can use today with Monero. But what we're doing next is to close this other little privacy gap, and that's the fact that when you run your own node and you broadcast a transaction, there can be bad nodes on the network that can log that. And those bad nodes can go, all right, I know that that transaction first came from from Riccardo's node, because that's the IP address that I first saw it from. And this is happening right now with Bitcoin. There are horribly, terribly bad Sybil attacks and login nodes that exist purely to track this stuff. So with I2P, which is a hidden internet service like Tor, we have a second layer, and we're building this out still. We have a second layer that will exist on top of the existing network. And that means that when transactions are broadcast, they'll go over that layer. Just transactions, not blocks. And ultimately what this means is that those logging nodes can only go, well, the first thing I saw it from was this random I2P address, which is largely meaningless. Now, that defends against passive surveillance. Now, privacy in a financial system and in most decentralized systems is pointless unless it is mandatory. And the reason for that is, let's imagine we have a digital currency with 100,000 users. And within this digital currency, we have a magical cloud of privacy. And it's super magical. Like, you put stuff in and you can't tell anything about it. The problem is that we only have 1,000 users. And that means when we move funds in and out of the magical cloud of privacy, our anonymity set is reduced to just those 1,000 users at best. It's probably a lot less because of all the leakage that happens when you move in and out. So a lack of mandatory privacy is pointless. And that's one of the things that we've been working so hard with Monero is to make sure that every single one of these privacy enhancements is mandatory. There's no way to opt out, at least not on any sort of massive scale. You can, reveal your transactions to the world if you really wanted to, but you're not really going to compromise anyone else's OPSEC except yours. When it comes to evaluating privacy technology, and this by and large goes for a lot of things, not just privacy enhancing technologies, but decentralized security software like Bitcoin, like Monero, like a lot of other cryptocurrencies today, ideology is as important as the technology behind it. And if we take a look at Monero's ideology, Monero is an open source project, and I'll explain a little bit more about Monero's birth in a second. But Monero contributors, when they start contributing to Monero as developers, we are aware that our code will definitely be responsible for securing people's money. If we screw up, somebody's going to lose their lunch. The other thing is, we're pretty sure, and we know that despite me telling people not to buy Monero, a whole bunch of people apparently largely ignore that, and so our code might be required to protect someone's life savings. They're going to go put their 401k in, and again, if we screw up, well, we're going to have some very angry people. But more importantly, we also know that our code might be responsible for keeping someone out of prison. They might do something that we don't object to, that we think is completely fine, and next minute, because they used Monero, the stuff that we do is responsible for them either going to jail or not. And perhaps most importantly, we're aware that the code we write might be the difference between life or death for someone. They might be in a country where, they buy a Bible, and that's something that we might not find morally objectionable. Maybe we do, but in general, I think people don't. But their government might find it morally objectionable, and next minute it's literally the difference between life or death for them because they use Monero. And that is a heavy, heavy responsibility. It means that we need to be careful and absolutely, absolutely sure about the things we do. And you have to ask yourself, with all of these projects, with any privacy-enhancing project, if it treats its work with less care than Monero, and not that Monero is some sort of baseline, but definitely if it treats it with less care than Monero, that is utterly irresponsible and unconscionable. And really, it's indistinguishable from a scam. And this is crucial because this is the sort of stuff we need to speak out about, because people are relying on these systems on a day-to-day basis, not only to secure their money, but to secure their privacy. And if we're not talking about it, if we're too afraid to talk about it because we think it's bad form or because, it's an open source project and we can't insult them, that's only going to backfire and end up hurting some poor innocent person who thinks that the thing they're using is utterly private and fantastic. Just to give you a little bit of background on Monero's birth and growth, Monero launched in April 2014, not by me and not by anyone that's currently involved with Monero, at least not that we know of. It was launched by a guy called Thankful for Today. On Bitcoin Talk, he pre-announced it and then launched it. And it was basically just a fair launch of the crypto note reference implementation. And then Thankful for Today ended up being a gigantic douchebag. And that didn't sit well with the community. So myself and 6 others forked it away from him. And the community followed us, which was kind of cool. The problem with that was that we didn't want an altcoin. We didn't set about going, hey, let's launch an altcoin. We can make so much money. And we ended up with this altcoin, which is like a baby being deposited on your door. And the bell rings at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you open, and there's this toddler, and you pick it up, and you're like, crap, what am I going to do? And now you don't really know what to do, because you don't want to give it away, because someone else is going to raise it, and they're probably going to do a bad job. And you know that maybe you'll be an okay parent, or at least not entirely terrible. And so you decide, well, you'll raise it yourself, along with your 6 other buddies that you've just met. And that's one thing leads to another. And what we found is, because we just kind of were thrown into it, we've seen massive contributor growth, because I think largely we didn't really know what we were doing. And so a whole bunch of people sort of pitched up to help us. And we've just seen commits per month increase from that launch period all the way to now. And the number of new contributors that the project has attracted has also been insane. Like the number of new contributors per month. And there's contributor churn and contributors haven't stuck around, but by and large, they have. And we have over 180 contributors that have contributed to all the Monero projects, and of which a third are still active. And that's pretty insane. We are also seeing a massive increase in, thank you. We're also seeing a massive increase in transactional growth, which is kind of cool, because it means that people aren't just using Monero for speculation, they're actually using Monero to do stuff. I don't know what the stuff is, I can't tell, but they're at least using it. And this is the number of transactions per week, excluding Coinbase transactions, and you can see the spike in transactions. And sure, some of that is attributed to speculators ignoring my advice and buying Monero to hold. But what is kind of cool is that we're seeing a massive growth in the community, and that sort of ties in with the fact that we see people using Monero. And so the number of hits that we're seeing on our subreddit, for example, coupled with the sustained subreddit subscriber growth, is indicative of the fact that the community is growing. They're interested in what's happening with Monero. And a slide I don't have here, but something that is kind of cool is that we've seen our nodes, our active and sort of high uptime nodes go from like 100 about a year and a half ago to nearly 1,000 nodes today. And that's, for a project where there's really no motivation to run a node except, hey, I like Monero and I like my privacy, that's really not a bad increase. But now we're trying to make Monero useful and usable, because for the longest time, Monero just existed as a bunch of command line tools, and people hated that. They all wanted easy to use stuff. And that's kind of hard because, again, it's an open source project driven by a bunch of people that, I don't know, we probably don't know what we're doing. We did add a bunch of all the other cool things, and these are inherently, some of them are inherently in Monero, and some of them are things that we added at a later stage. For example, we have a dynamic fee structure. So as Monero is used and the block size increases and number of transactions increase, the fees decrease because presumably more transactional demand means a higher price in relative terms, and so therefore the fee needs to decrease. We also have no block size limit. Well, we do, but it's dynamic because the block size limit grows again as there is increased usage. So we start hitting that cap on block size limit, it pushes higher, and it scales. Well, I mean, it scales on-chain, but really, if you want to scale, you've got to scale off-chain. We have a disconnected architecture, so you run a Monero node, that thing connects you to the Monero network, and then all your wallets can sit behind that. And that's kind of cool because like in our home, we have one Monero node sitting on the network, and then the wallets on my computer or on my wife's computer, they can all connect to that one node, and we don't need to have like 3 different nodes all connecting to the same network, which is rather pointless. We also have this thing we developed called Open Alias, and that's a DNSSEC secured aliasing scheme, which also uses Namecoin and some other distributed DNS systems. And basically what that allows you to do is set up an alias so that you can make a payment to rick@spagni.net or donate.getmonero.org, and that alias gets pulled through. And if you own an existing domain, that's really powerful because you don't need to worry about that land rush for people registering Fluffy Pony or whatever as an alias. And then we have an accessible proof of work algorithm, which a lot of people are excited about for some reason, because it means that it closes the performance gap between CPUs, GPUs, and ASICs. You can't make anything ASIC proof, it doesn't exist. But what it does mean is that today, in a landscape dominated by GPU miners, CPU miners are still viable, and that's kind of cool too. We recently, in December, launched the first beta of the Monero Core GUI, and this is something that took over a year of solid work, and something that we actually started in 2014 when we started wireframing it and building out these elements and whatever. And for an open source project to go from 0 to a functional GUI is a lot of work and a lot of stress, but we think we've built something really cool. And if you do want to play with Monero, I encourage you to download the beta. There's a new beta that's coming out in the next week or two, and play around with it. And it really is, I think it's a pretty GUI and a pretty slick way to interact and use Monero, interact with. We also have this thing called a view key, which is a way that we provide optional regulatory compliance, well, not just for regulatory compliance, but for other reasons. What the view key does is it allows you to give a private key out, either publicly or to an individual or to a company or whatever. They can see your incoming transactions, and we're adding functionality for them to be able to also optionally see your outgoing transactions, but they can't spend your money. Now, this is really powerful because, again, for a privacy-enhancing project, you don't want to enable things like charities or whatever to have fraud internally that they can't control. So charities can publish their view key publicly, and now you can see how much money is going in, and they can't lie about that and skim off the top. Similarly, law enforcement could come and knock on your door and say, we'd like to see your Monero view key, and that's a way to have this regulatory compliance without them really needing to touch your private keys and spend your money, be able to spend your money and so on, which is not ideal. And in future, well, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're doing. I mentioned briefly about off-chain scaling, and that's some of the things that we're playing with at the moment. Stuff like Lightning Network, Tumblebit, and Mimblewimble, which are fantastic scaling enhancing solutions, and we're looking at ways that we can incorporate that into Monero. And there's lots of other cool stuff that we're doing, building systems on top of Monero, like Monero ID and Monero Trust, which are trust and identity systems that use Monero as a base layer. And we're hoping that by building these components out, eventually we'll be able to add stuff that hinges into trust and identity systems, because if you're going to have stuff like smart contracts without a trust and identity system, it's kind of pointless. So we're starting at the ground level and sort of building it up, and eventually, hopefully, one day maybe, and whoever knows how long, if Monero is still around, we'll have cool stuff like smart contracts. And that's about all that I have to say to you today, and thank you very much for having me.